hello. I'm Casey.
And I'm Fallon.
And this is
Render the Darkness.
So today we are still in Arkansas for our 50 state series, but this is the bonus episode that I talked about doing in our last episode. So for those of you who listened to that, which is hopefully all of you, this is going to be our bonus episode. Before we get into the bonus episode, let me go ahead and give you your fun fact. Prince, one of the greatest musicians of all time.
Yes.
Anyway, he played 27 different instruments on his debut album when he was just 20 years old.
Dang.
So yeah, crazy talented guy and an extraordinary musician and gone way too soon. So rest in peace, Prince. Thank you for gracing the world with all of your talents. Okay, so on to the bonus episode, which was actually a recommendation, and it is going to be about Richard Sharpe Shaver. What a rabbit hole this story was. This is one of those stories that starts with you thinking, okay, and then quickly escalates to, wait, what? Let's get more into that.
All right. I'm ready.
I am super glad that I did get the opportunity to look into this one because Fallon's super ready. And I do agree with the person who recommended it. His story does need to be told, and it does need to be more in the public than it is, I think. I personally had never heard of it, so I'm glad I took the time to learn more about it.
Me too. I'm excited to learn more about it too. Yeah.
Let me tell you what. I ended up deducing from the rabbit hole I traveled down on this one. So, there's two main humans in this one. You'll obviously find out why I worded it that way as we talk about the case.
Okay.
Obviously, Richard Sharpe Shaver, who I've already mentioned. I'm punching my mic, so if y'all heard that, I'm sorry. And the other human that we're going to be talking about in this one is a man who had a pretty big connection to the whole thing, and his name was Raymond Alfred Palmer. He was the editor of a magazine in whom Shaver entrusted the information that we're going to be talking about with. So let's talk a little bit about these two fellas. We're going to start off talking about Raymond Alfred Palmer first. And let me tell you, I could have written an entire episode on this man's life alone. What an interesting guy he was, and what an interesting life he had. I'm going to give you quite a bit of his history, but nowhere near all of it. Just enough to get us to the point that Richard Shaver comes in, because he's the main person of this case.
Gotcha.
So here we go.
Mark. Sit.
We have to say go.
That's just implied.
We have to say it. Nobody doesn't go when it goes not said.
Ew.
I don't like the way he said it. It doesn't feel very encouraging or inspiring.
Go!
I'm motivated. Motivation. Raymond Alfred Palmer was born August 1st, 1910 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His parents' names were... That was really... Why did I yell that? His parents' names were... I'm sorry. I did not mean to yell that at all. Anyway, his parents' names were Roy and Helen Palmer. He had a sister named Evelyn and a brother named David. When Palmer was 7, he experienced a terrible accident after running into traffic where he was run over by a truck. Or I guess technically his legs got caught in the tire and he was kind of hit against the road until the truck stopped.
Oh my God.
This caused several bones in his back to break. His dad refused to take him to the hospital, which ultimately led to him developing Pott's disease. For those that don't know what that is, it's basically tuberculosis of the spine.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you right there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
She's crunching a candy on the corner as if you guys can't hear the crunch.
I actually want to see it, but I was realizing whenever I was looking, you could see a big...
bulge in
yeah.
it?
I was like, that don't. Okay. I wanted to go ahead and...
You're eliminating the bulge.
I mean, it was like, yeah. It was very noticeable, so I was like, okay, sorry. Oh, that's spicy.
That was spicy. Thanks for sharing your bulge with us. Some of us may not have noticed. Okay, anyway. So by 9, he was completely bedridden. He was subjected to multiple forms of treatment. He underwent bone grafts, and he spent a year in the prone position, which, if you don't know what that is, flat on his back.
Oh, okay.
His graft became infected, and he continued to experience multiple issues due to his injuries over the years.
Oh, that's terrible.
He spent about 6 years in what was called a Bradford frame, which is like a rectangular metal frame that's fitted and adjusted, like it's adjusted through straps of canvas used to support a patient with disease or any kind of like fracture of the spine, hip, or pelvis.
That sounds terrible.
Well, hey, it's saved some lives and healed some people, so.
Well, yeah,
I mean, at the
I'm
time,
just saying, the visual that I got, it
well, you gotta remember the time frame too. So, like, at the time, that was super advanced technology, you know. So, due to his issues with his spine by adulthood, he stood at only around 4 feet tall, and he had a hunchback.
Oh.
He always seemed to like blame his dad for all of his health issues and handicaps, which over time caused Palmer to become angry and introverted. Which I could kind of see why he blamed the dad, because if he had gotten the medical care that he'd gotten immediately, or should have gotten immediately, maybe he wouldn't have gone through as much as he did.
Yeah.
So I could kind of see,
yeah, for sure,
where he might feel that way. Palmer grew up reading a lot due to his confinement to the Bradford frame, as well as just his natural curiosity. He became quite infatuated with ancient Egyptian history and science fiction, or sci-fi, as I'll be referring to it throughout the case. Around 1926, he began reading a magazine called Amazing Stories. He began submitting his own stories, and they did actually publish quite a few.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Turns out he had quite the knack for writing. He really did.
Awesome.
I read some of what he wrote, and it actually was, he really did.
Well, I'll have to do that after this.
Yeah. Palmer and a man by the name of Walter Dennis joined forces to create a science correspondence club in May of 1930 so fans could connect with one another. This club would go on to be considered the first organized science fiction fandom group. They also created and edited the first of something called a fanzine, which I personally had never heard of. So I guess it's like a magazine, but like a magazine created by the fans rather than like official authors and publishers, if I understand it right. So you get, fan and then magazine together, so fanzine. I thought it was pretty interesting. Theirs was called The Comet, and first appeared in May 1930, which was the same month and year as their correspondence club. They would end up changing the name from The Comet to Cosmology. Palmer resigned as editor in 1932. Also in 1932, Palmer would co-found another fanzine called The Time Traveler. After a year, it kind of faded out. I'll tell you why in a minute. In between The Comet and Cosmology, also in 1930, unfortunately, he would become ill again, which is part of what caused him to resign from his editor position in 1932. He would be diagnosed with Pott's disease for a second time, and he was told he only had about 6 months to live due to the rapid deterioration of his spine.
Oh, gosh.
The doctors actually decided to do nothing for him this time. Palmer would spend another year laying on his back, and somehow, despite all the odds and everything the doctors are telling him, miraculously, his back technically did heal itself somehow, and he was medically released in 1931.
Awesome.
It was noted after this, Palmer would develop a bit of a God complex, which we know now was more likely a trauma response triggered by fear. But the point is, he began believing he had the ability to build a natural resistance to his disease, and he was convinced he could control it.
Oh, okay.
He also began to believe that not only that his dreams were showing him visions, but also that he could see the future, or at the very least predict it, which derived out of him being told by doctors he wouldn't make it past 6 months, him having a vision that he would survive, which gave him faith and confidence that he would survive, and him actually surviving.
Okay.
So all of those things coupled together kind of gave him this notion that, he can determine the future. He knows what's going to happen more than doctors do. They told him he had 6 months. He was like, "No, I'm going to live." And the doctors were like, "I don't think so, man." And then he did. So he was like, "Well, who's the smarter one here? Who knows more?"
Yeah. Okay. I guess I can understand his logic behind that, I suppose.
But he also believed he could determine outcomes, which caused him to have a compulsive need to control everything around him. By 1935, he was writing again. He was writing stories for the Amazing Stories magazine again, Marvel Tale magazine, and Wonder Stories magazine. So all three of those magazines he was submitting his stories to, and they were all publishing his stories as well.
Nice.
He quickly became a notable writer. In 1938, Palmer was officially hired to be the editor of Amazing Stories magazine. By the time he made it to the magazine, it was barely holding on. Palmer needed to redirect the focus audience, and to do this, he changed the approach the magazine had previously used. He focused more on the story opposed to the science that the previous editor had seemed to emphasize on. And reading this whole thing, it seemed kind of like the beginning of like the tabloid era. Like they didn't call it that, but that's what it felt like to me when I was reading all of that. Palmer began recruiting stories from his friends. He utilized having science friends who ran a talent agency for science fiction authors. He regularly used their stories combined with his own stories implemented as well. The magazine started quickly climbing back up, and he began hiring these authors, these science fiction authors, to write stories for the magazine as well. So he kind of like recreated the whole infrastructure of this magazine.
Okay.
And that is nowhere near the end of Palmer's accomplishments, nor the things that he did up to this point, or the things that he will go on to accomplish later on down the line. But it does bring us up to speed to the point in his life that he and our next person crossed paths, and gives us a smooth transition into Richard Sharpe Shaver, which is who this episode is actually about.
All right.
Let's talk a little bit about the history of Shaver. And when I say a little bit, I mean a little bit. Because as far as his childhood is concerned, which is actually really crazy, I could find seemingly endless information on Palmer. I couldn't find hardly anything on Shaver's childhood.
Really?
Oh. Yeah, it was like from the time he was like 18 and younger, like his whole life was just erased almost. Like it was real. Maybe it's just the way that I was doing my research. I don't usually have problems researching people, and I found a whole lot on Shaver. I'm not saying that I didn't, but as far as his like younger years, there just wasn't a whole lot out there.
Oh, okay.
So I'll do my best to tell you as much as I can with what I could find. I have a couple of sources that say he was born on October 8th, and some say he was born on October 7th, but they all agree he was born in October 1907. Most of the sources said he was born in Berwick, Pennsylvania, but I also did see in a couple that said he was born in Virginia, but his family moved to Berwick sometime in 1910.
Okay.
His parents' names were Ziba Rice Shaver and Grace Taylor Shaver.
Ziba Rice?
Ziba Rice.
Wow, that's a very interesting name.
I know he had siblings, but I'm not sure how many, or even for sure what their names were.
Okay.
The names and the amount of siblings seem to change from source to source and book to book, so I didn't put it in here because there was just no way to know which resource was accurate and which one wasn't.
Right, okay.
It's so bizarre because like every resource said something different about the events of his life up to the point in his life that we're about to talk about. So I'm just going to give some of the basic events that were consistently told that were said to have happened around the same time in 1932.
Okay.
that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Ah, gets it.
It was like, one magazine was like, oh, he was 6 foot tall, and another magazine was like, oh, he was 5'10". The other magazine was like, oh, he was 5'8". It was like, well, how tall was he?
Right, yeah.
One of those situations. But the things they all agreed on are the little facts that I'm going to throw in here. He had a wife and a daughter. His brother died. Richard quit his job, and we'll get into that in a second. Richard went AWOL. Richard spent some time in a mental institution. His wife died while he was in a mental institution. Her family took the baby, told the baby he was deceased, and Richard was gone for nearly a decade.
Well, dang.
Those are the facts that everybody could agree on.
Okay.
Okay? So let's jump back just a little bit and talk more about the job Shaver quit.
Okay.
He was working an assembly line at the Ford Auto plant in Detroit, Michigan, when he began to hear things. And it only seemed to happen when he picked up his spot welder. He claimed that when he was using it, he could hear people being tortured, and he could hear his coworkers' thoughts.
Oh.
He was convinced the sounds of the tortured people were coming from caverns underneath the Earth's surface. He thought he had found a way to tap into people's thoughts in an underground ancient alien language that he called Mantong.
Okay.
Mantong. Over the years, he would actually tell many different versions of how he actually discovered this language, but this one was the most frequent and the most consistent.
Okay.
After this experience, he quit his job and claimed to have done several things while he was gone, from living underground with what he referred to as an ancient civilization to simply just being a vagabond. There's definitely records to confirm that he did spend some time frame in a psychiatric institution, but not all of the time that he was gone for can be accounted through medical records.
Okay.
Shaver left in 1932, and he didn't resurface until 1943.
Huh.
That's when he would not only write the first letter that gained him his recognition, but it's also when Shaver and Palmer would cross paths. For the first time, and Palmer would play a large role in the level of recognition that Shaver would ultimately receive. This letter is when Shaver would go into great detail about his discoveries of an ancient language, the Mantong language, and he would describe exactly what it was and how others could understand it. He claimed that Mantong was where all of Earth's languages came from. He believed every word in any language had a hidden meaning. He said there was a formula one could use to decipher the meaning. Palmer tested Shaver's theory on quite a few words and became convinced that Shaver was on the path to something astonishing. So I think I didn't say that when I first started saying this little piece of it, but they crossed paths because Shaver submitted this letter to the Amazing Stories magazine. And actually, the writer who initially received the letter from Shaver concluded that it was hogwash and threw it in the trash, and Palmer actually took it out of the trash and kind of ran with it.
Okay.
Fascinated by Shaver's letter, Palmer wrote back. He wanted to know more details. He wanted to know exactly how Shaver had made such a profound discovery. Shaver would respond to Palmer with a letter titled A Warning to Future Man. In this letter, Shaver would explain what he began to hear through his welding gun in 1932. He also explained that he thought it was possible that there was a defect in the coils of the gun that were allowing him to tap into his coworkers' thoughts, as well as hearing the torturing being performed by malevolent entities in the underground caverns. Again, this story did vary throughout the years, but this is the one he put in his letter. He also went on to talk about advanced races that built cities in underground caverns. He also claimed that these races would eventually leave Earth due to radiation from the sun. When doing this, they left behind some of their own kind. These left-behinds were referred to as Taros, who, according to Shaver, eventually declined into a race of sadists known as Deros, which he said stood for detrimental robots. When he says that, he doesn't mean actual robots. He just referred to them as that based on how they acted so savagely, and he believed they were being controlled by some other force that was making them cause harm to humans.
Okay.
According to Shaver, the Deros would kidnap humans by the thousands for food and to torture them. He claimed the Deros had a machine called a ray that they used to watch or hunt humans, if you will. He said this machine had the capability to send torturous thoughts into the human's mind. He wrote about how this race of ancient beings could be the ones at the root of all of Earth's ill will, examples being natural disasters, disease, etc.
Hmm.
He claimed the Deros also had spaceships that they used to travel to make deals with other extraterrestrial beings. He again claimed in this letter that he had been held captive by the Deros for years and could locate the caverns. As intrigued as Palmer was by Shaver's letter, he wanted to publish it, but needed a more exciting plot. Make that make sense.
I was going to say, like, that wasn't exciting enough?
Apparently not. I think it wasn't necessarily that it needed a more exciting plot. I think he was worried that when people read what he actually put, that they would deem him, spinning tales. Kind of like the original editor who got the letter and threw it in the trash did. He was worried that that's what would happen if he just published the letter outright, so he kind of tweaked it a little bit.
Okay.
He still left in what Shaver put in it, but he kind of gave it a storyline, I guess would be the best way to word that. He kind of created a story for the story.
Okay.
If that makes sense. When Shaver sent the letter in, it was around 10,000 words.
Ooh.
By the time Palmer was done with it, it was a whopping 31,000 words. So he added his own 21,000 words to this letter. He also gave it a new title called I Remember Lemuria. Or Lemuria, however you want to say that. He published it in March 1945. Eventually, Palmer would develop a compilation of Shaver's work, and he would call it the Shaver Mystery.
Okay.
Apparently, that issue sold out, and thousands of people wrote in, many claiming the story was false, others saying they too had heard strange noises amongst other things, and others making claims of being held captive by the ancient beings themselves.
Ooh.
Even Fred Chrisman, who I might actually do a case on later, he got in on the letter bandwagon, and he's best known for his role in the JFK Kennedy assassination and the Maury Island incident.
Ooh.
So if you know anything about those two things, Chrisman was involved in those things as well. Because the story gave the magazine such an increase in sales and circulation, the story was still being mentioned for years after the original release. Apparently, Palmer relied on Shaver's stories so much from 1945 to 1948 that it said that the magazine consisted mostly all of stories from Shaver. Some issues were only stories from Shaver.
Okay, like he was having him write in a bunch of different stories and just made like a...
Yeah, he just made like a continuous storyline out of it. Like, tell me more, and then every time he would tell him more, he would use that for his next.
Okay.
A lot of the magazine's readers disapproved of Palmer's insistence to publish Shaver's stories, referring to them as a hoax. They even began a campaign to persuade the publishers of the magazine to stop publishing Shaver's articles altogether. Palmer began using these letters of controversy as material for the magazine.
All right, throw in a little bit of drama.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
Yeah, getting that any way you can. He began publishing the letters alongside his response, often arguing for Shaver's stories.
Nice. Okay.
People tried to emphasize that Shaver had clear characteristics of a paranoid schizophrenic. Fans believed that all of their efforts had finally worked in 1948 when the magazine did in fact stop publishing Shaver's stories.
Aww.
Palmer made it known that that was not why they stopped publishing his stories, but that it was because they were pressured by someone outside the magazine to do so. Who was that someone outside the magazine, you wonder? According to the owner, it was the decrease in sales that caused the dropping of Shaver's stories. So,
okay.
Basically, people stopped buying the magazine if they had any of his stories in them.
Okay, so they kind of like boycotted.
So they boycotted the magazine. Whenever they realized that their picketing against it wasn't working, they boycotted people buying the magazines altogether.
Okay, yep.
After that, Shaver's stories, they did die down quite a bit, minus being mentioned here and there on radio shows in the 50s. Shaver and his wife tried to keep his stories in the limelight through their magazine, which was called the Shaver Mystery Magazine, off and on for several years. That's his second wife.
Oh.
Just, I forgot to mention that he got married again. So, Shaver never gave up hope of being able to one day prove this ancient race did exist, and that is when Shaver would introduce the rock books. In the years between the 60s and the 70s, Shaver became obsessed with these rock books that he believed contained messages from the Diro.
Rock books.
Rock books. I'll explain to you what those are in just a second.
I was going to ask, but I was like, well, she's probably going to get to it.
Literally my next sentence. He wrote about these rocks for years. He painted hundreds of pictures of them, he took pictures of them, and he drew out what he believed was the translation of what the rocks said in an attempt to prove their importance. So just in case that wasn't clear on my description of what a rock book is, he believed he could look at a rock and literally interpret a message out of like the lines in the rock and where the humps were and like the designs in the rock, and so he thought the rocks were telling a story or speaking through the Diro. Based on, so literally rock books.
Okay, because when I was thinking like maybe he's taking rocks and like put them beside each other and trying to figure out a message that way.
No, he literally thought that they were communicating through the rocks.
Okay.
Basically. A person could even at one point get a piece of one of the rocks with a transcription of what was written or drawn on it. The rock books didn't seem near the success as his stories did, but he did gain quite a bit of recognition after he passed away on November 5th, 1975 in Summit, Arkansas.
I kind of like a rock book. I think that'd be interesting to see what, the different messages that he...
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be kind of cool.
Oh, that would be right. Shaver would have written around 20 books. His work, which was the paintings of the rocks, were featured in many museums from California to New York. They were even featured in traveling expeditions called Create and Be Recognized. Shaver's stories have been used in many short stories and movies. Shaver and the Diros he speaks of are even featured in a video game, and even more interestingly, they're even used in Dungeons and Dragons. I think they're like one of the dwarf people or one of the elf people are considered Diros.
Oh, nice.
And they fit almost the exact description of what he said that these were.
Okay, cool.
So, whether you believe what Shaver was saying or not, whether you thought these were the ramblings of a schizophrenic or it was a hoax, something did come out of it. There were many who believed him and very much believed the Diros existed and still exist, and that the alphabet is very much real, which was the alphabet that he created for the Mantong language.
Okay.
I will say Shaver very much believed what he was saying was true. I mean, he devoted his entire life to proving it. So, like, this case, what I've said so far was kind of a generalization of what Shaver believed and Palmer's obsession with making it the story of a lifetime. But I deep dove a little further into the Diros themselves, and what I found was pretty interesting.
Cool.
The original race, referred to as the Titan Atlans, they are said to be a race from the legend of Atlantis. You know, the one with Plato, the one Plato was telling people about.
Yeah.
The legend of Atlantis was thought to be a whole civilization of half human, half gods. So, like demigods, if you will. Loki. No one really knows for sure where Atlantis was supposed to be located, and most scientists believe it never existed at all. And yes, I know there's the lost city of Atlantis, but that's not really what we're talking about here. The theory is, or at least from what I interpret it to be, and someone else, if you get something different, please let me know. But the theory is that when the Atlantis civilization left Earth, they left behind some of their offspring, and they would over time become the angry and greedy beings that Shaver believed to be the Diro. Palmer took this information and really ran with it, so it's hard to know exactly how much of the stories written are what Shaver said or what Palmer added.
Right.
But if you go further into it, the idea that they had machines that allowed them to cause problems for humans, combined with sorry, checked my phone. Anyway, the idea of that combined with tracing it back to the Atlantis theory and putting those two things together, this wasn't like a Shaver exclusive notion or belief that these beings existed. There was a whole generation of people who believed that these people existed or these demigods existed. Like, I mean, Greek mythology is based almost entirely around not necessarily the heroes, but the demigods and that kind of stuff or whatever. So there's a long line of history here. Um, it's believed that they can even create dreams or make humans see whatever they want them to. They also supposedly use the machines to abduct humans, according to Shaver. And he also believed that there were good ones among the bad ones that he referred to, and he referred to them as Taros because they were the ones who didn't transition to the bad ones, so they stayed the Taros.
Okay.
And the Deros. So
Taros and Deros.
Okay, so bringing all that to light, let's talk a little bit about Lemuria. Remember when Palmer changed the title of Shaver's story to I Remember Lemuria?
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about that. This is a folklore all on its own. This was originally said to be a continent that had sunken due to the shifting of tectonic plates. There was a type of race believed to have existed on the island called Lemurians, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Some believed that they were half human, half lemurs. You decide on that one.
Lemurs?
Lemurs. They were said to have 4 hands and like the lemur body and then like the human head and like they were their own mythological creature in themselves.
Oh.
So needless to say, scientists would not only go on to vehemently deny this race of humans ever existed, but they would also go on to claim they could prove that Lemuria or Lemuria itself never existed at all. Which kind of makes you wonder why Palmer chose that to be the title for Shaver's first published story.
Yeah.
And it also makes you kind of wonder how much of what Shaver said did Palmer actually believe, or did he just kind of see Shaver as like a golden ticket?
Yeah.
Because when I was reading that and putting all the pieces together, I mean, I kind of put it as maybe he did believe some of what he was saying, but I think that he kind of created this mythology behind what he was saying to spin it in a way that would make it interesting to people. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
You know what, Palmer?
Yeah, Palmer. Like, I think he embellished the facts and kind of combined them with other things that maybe people were believing in at the time to give it a more realistic spin to the readers. Because he'd been diving into the sci-fi world for years, so he knew what everybody was believing in that at that time. So it would have been very easy for him to kind of like, put those stories together to create one cohesive realm of belief.
Yeah.
But I will say, whether he believed what Shaver was saying or he didn't believe what Shaver was saying, not only did he get Shaver the recognition for what he was saying and believing in, but even after he quit editing, he always stood by Shaver's side and his beliefs. So even whenever he stopped putting the stories in the magazine and he was told to not have anything else to do with Shaver's stories, he still publicly supported Shaver and everything that Shaver said. So I don't know if that boils down to he really believed what Shaver was saying, or if that really boiled down to everybody knowing he was the one publishing those stories and he needed to stand behind the fact that he had published all those stories.
That might be a little bit of both.
So, yeah, it's hard to say on this one, and like I said, it's hard to say if this was like a real thing or something that was created in Shaver's mind. But I do know that regardless of what other people think, Shaver very much believed it was true.
Yeah.
And who knows? For all we know, there's a whole nother dimensional plane that maybe he was stepping into every time he closed his eyes, for all we know. So that very much may have been a reality to him. We don't know everything that's out there, and, that's kind of why it's really good that people like, me and Fallon exist, and other people who do what we do, and cryptozoologists and people who are interested in the things that we're interested in. That's one of the benefits for us, is that we get to kind of dive into that stuff and get a whole different perspective and idea of, is this real? Could it be real? Is it possible for it to be real? And, I think it all boils down the same for everybody. I feel like it boils down to, why not?
Yeah, yeah.
Why not?
Sure.
Why
like,
couldn't
I
it
think
be?
it could possibly very well be true. I mean, because we don't know what's out there.
Yeah.
I mean, and we got to be pretty, I mean, not trying to upset anybody, but we got to be pretty selfish to think that we are the only ones.
Right.
I mean, there's just no way.
Yeah. I agree. No, I agree with that completely.
And now, whenever you were saying that he was gone for those, like
yeah, for like 11 years.
Was he gone? Like nobody knew where he was, or he was just out of the public view?
No, he disappeared from public view.
Okay.
But again, like I said at the beginning, there are records to prove that some of those 11 years he was gone, he was in and out of mental institutions.
Okay.
Some of it, but not all of it. And I really feel like for the years that he was kind of disappeared or whatever, he very much could have created a life on a different path. Do you know what I mean? Like to me, and I'm not a doctor, but from what I know about people who experience schizophrenia, which is what a lot of people kept trying to say they felt like he had, their stories don't stay the same path most of the time.
Yeah, the facts aren't the same all
right.
the time.
And don't get me wrong, his facts did change. They weren't the same every time, but they had the same baseline. Like, they revolved around the same thing. They all involved the Diro. They all involved his adamancy that he was aware of this race and these caverns, and he had spent time with them, and he had heard them. And, so the fact that none of that changed, and it wasn't like he kept this going for a couple years to get fame and then stopped. Like, he devoted his whole life to the idea that this was a real thing.
Yeah.
So to me, it would be blindsided of me to say that he was wrong.
Yeah.
Because who am I to say what he saw and what he experienced and what he believed? And, people have different life experiences all the time. I strongly believe that there are other realms and dimensions and parallels that some people are lucky enough to be introduced to and see and experience, and other people aren't.
Right.
I think we talked a little bit about something like that when we were interviewing with Maxim. We talked a little bit about the different dimensions and how some people, I think he mentioned, usually women get more experiences than men for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Where there are people who get a little bit of insight on those other realms that most people aren't privy to. Yeah. And it's hard to believe something that you've never seen for yourself. But you can't see air, but it exists, yeah. Right? So who's to say?
Yep, I agree. Wholeheartedly.
I think the best approach for me personally is to just be open-minded about all of it and lean towards what my gut tells me the most. And again, attaching this and being able to attach this with Atlantis, I kind of believe they was onto something.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's definitely interesting, and unlike you, he definitely believed what he was saying, and like I said, I'm not going to say he didn't see it.
Yeah, I'm never going to say he didn't see it, because even if it does or it doesn't exist, he genuinely believed that he saw it. So it was real to him, regardless.
And I know some of the stuff that he was saying was kind of like a scary, dangerous type factor, but I kind of want to believe that it does exist out there somewhere.
I mean, I don't necessarily want to believe that there are aliens out there torturing humans for sport, but
not that part. I just meant that that there are other
races out there. Yeah, I mean that's where the storylines for things like Men in Black. That comes from something. That comes from somewhere.
Oh, that pug! I love that little pug.
I mean, just the different types of aliens and stuff that were designed to be in that movie. I mean, imagination. People create things. Yeah, sure, that's true.
Yeah.
But let's say somebody believes in like past lives.
Yeah.
Who's to say that's not something they've seen in a past life, and that's why it's an image that lives in their heads?
Yeah, yeah. Or
Who's
like,
to say?
some people believe like birthmarks are supposedly how you died in your past life.
Past life, yeah.
I've heard that. Like,
yeah, like there's so many different theories that are out there that, like, who's to say? You know, I know in a religious aspect what we're saying is completely far-fetched, and that's fine. To each their own. I support everybody believing whatever they want to believe because, you know, our beliefs come from what we've experienced, what we've been taught, what we believe. All of those things combined create what we do and don't believe and think or whatever. I'm just speaking for me personally, where I stand on it. And I just believe that it would be really, really blindsided of me to not believe that it's possible.
Yep.
It's possible. So that was what I got out of the story for Richard Shaver. It was a really interesting dive.
It was. Very cool. Very cool.
You know, I tried to keep it short because that's kind of what we're doing for the 50 States series. But there's definitely lots of links attached to the show notes for this case for anybody that wants to dive into that a little bit further or get a little more information. There's also a book, Shaverology, The Shaver Mysteries. I'm going to post a link for that. There's tons of stuff about this case out in the world. So if you're interested and you want a little more details or maybe to get your own perspective or take on the information, please follow any of these links or Google it. It's a really interesting thing to get into. So I definitely would recommend other people doing that because, as we said before, not everybody's perspectives are the same.
Right.
So just because that's what I got out of the story doesn't mean that that's what you might get out of the story. So each their own. But interesting nonetheless.
I'm going to have to look at some of them little links there because I didn't get to read any of it.
Yeah.
So, yay.
But yeah, very interesting. And we appreciate you guys spending time with us today and hanging out with us. If you like what we're doing, please subscribe, share, like, tell a friend.
Yeah. Tell the world.
Tell the world. 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 But yeah, I think that's it for this episode. And again, thank you guys for spending time with us. And we are Render the Darkness.